Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. I'm very happy today to have back on Wider View John Marciano. John is Professor Emeritus at State University of New York, who is currently living down in Talent, Oregon. John, welcome back. It's nice to have you back on the show.
Yeah, nice to be back, Charles. Thank you.
So we are recording this on Thursday, the 19th, yesterday evening, the day of the impeachment vote. And of course, it went almost exclusively on party lines. The House voted to impeach. You know, what I heard in the little bit I did hear of the debate were a lot of Democrats referring back to the Russiagate idea, that the idea that Russia and Putin, because we always personalize our enemy, are trying to destroy our democracy and interfere in our free and fair elections. And I know you have an article about that, so maybe you can respond to that idea.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I was thinking back when the House Intelligence Committee began the hearings, and Adam Schiff was quoted as saying something to the effect that this is all about democracy. I think the hidden agenda, which a number of people have argued online in really fine articles, one of them being Jim Kavanaugh, another one being Rick Sterling, that the hidden agenda behind all of this is that Putin and the Russians are destroying American democracy. As you and I have discussed, now with the Ukraine gate sort of being an offshoot of Russiagate, despite some of the Mueller findings, this is the thread that continues to go. And so we need to ask the question, are Putin and the Russians destroying American democracy? I maybe would start with the whole idea, do we have a democracy when, if one would look at American history, our democracies run by and for the rich and corporations? I mean, that was the view of one of our founders, John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who stated that those who own the country ought to run it. And, you and I know, and the American people know, that since the 80s, particularly, inequality has deepened dramatically in the country under Republicans and Democrats. And are Putin and Russia responsible for the big money assault on our democracy, which, of course, has been ordained by the Supreme Court in that decision, which really told us that corporations are people and they have free speech? I mean, doesn't that seem ridiculous to you?
Yeah. And it's also interesting that we find the Russians interfering in our elections and interfering in our political process, but we seem to be blind to the interference of another country, and that country would be Israel.
Oh, yeah. We hear a lot more about Israel. I mean, there's no doubt that our democracy has been corrupted by foreign powers, most powerfully by Israel through the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, various leaders like Netanyahu, who certainly have exercised, powerful influence over our elected representatives who fall into line on Israeli policies. So we have to ask the question, are Putin and Russia responsible for what Israel has done? But also there's Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. There's almost no discussion about Saudi Arabia's involvement in our democracy in terms of their funding. They've lobbied Congress and the presidency for decades. They've helped NGOs like the Clinton Foundation's think tanks, universities, law firms, political action committees. So how is it that it's not a principled objection to foreign interference in our democracy? and then there has been foreign interference. It's a partisan accusation that focuses on Russia and not Israel and not Saudi Arabia. So I have to question whether people are really upset about interference.
Both the Russiagate and the Ukraine gate, which is sort of a continuation, are very hot topics inside the Beltway, but I don't think most Americans are really that concerned about this. Probably they shouldn't be, as a matter of fact. The problem with Russia and Putin, as we have discussed prior on this program, and you have a book out about the whole subject of U.S.-Russia relations, is the demonization now of Russia. So Russia is, for whatever reason, our biggest enemy. Why is it that Russia is considered to be our enemy, and is that inevitable?
Well, I don't think it's inevitable. And of course, depending on the period in history that you look at, there wasn't demonization. For example, Stephen Cohen, the historian, who I think is arguably the most knowledgeable American scholar on the former Soviet Union and Russia now, points out that there wasn't any kind of demonization in the 1990s when the U.S. made sure that Boris Yeltsin remained in power in Russia and helped Western interests and Russian oligarchs loot that country with probably the greatest decline in living standards of any country in modern history. The U.S. massively involved itself in Yeltsin's reelection in 1996, arranging IMF loans, having U.S. officials organize Yeltsin's reelection campaign. He was lauded as a Democrat and wonderful guy in Time, in Newsweek, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post. And when Putin came into office, he was essentially appointed by Yeltsin and began to try to rebuild Russia from that catastrophic decade after the fall of the Soviet Union, that this notion that it was going to be an independent and strong country then posed a threat to U.S. interests. As long as they were subservient under Yeltsin, you didn't get any of this demonization. You didn't get the Democrats in Congress making these kind of speeches that you see today.
No, that's absolutely true. And certainly, our relationships with other countries, most notably recently Bolivia, pretty well demonstrate that democracy is not something that we care about as a national government.
Well, sure. I mean, and think about this, that what comes to mind in terms of Bolivia and, virtually every country in Latin America and other places in the world is that our democracy has been massively corrupted, particularly since 1947 by the CIA. Mm-hmm. It's meddled in dozens of foreign elections. It's fomented coups and regime changes, engaged in assassinations, all of this in violation, of course, of the UN Charter and the U.S. Constitution. Now, are Putin and Russia responsible for what the CIA has done, which has been kept secret from people here in this country? So therefore, you have a destruction of the people's right to know, which is essential in a democratic society. Now, Putin didn't engineer all of this. This was engineered in Washington by unelected officials, right on down to, certainly under all the way through Obama and continuing. I mean, John Brennan, former CIA director, under Obama, now a big shot commentator, along with James Clapper, former head of the NSA, telling us about, all the machinations of the Russians and they're doing this and that. These guys are running, a secret agency. Mm-hmm. I mean, what does that have to do with democracy?
No. Well, and as I think others have pointed out, I mean, the level of Russian interference, even the indictments by the Mueller investigation, there's very, very little, if any, proof that there was an intent by the Russian government to interfere in the election, and certainly not that if that attempt, if it were made, was successful.
The fundamental basis for all of this stuff is really the accusation that it was Putin ordering Russian intelligence to hack the Democratic Party computers in July 2016 to damage the candidacy of Hillary Clinton. I've argued, actually in an op-ed today in the Ashland Tidings, that this election accusation is the biggest fake news since Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. Mm-hmm. There may have been Russians interfering or Russian hackers in that country doing all sorts of things online, just as U.S. hackers do. But the charge is that essentially this order came from the top, from Putin. And the number of people who are involved with the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, the former U.S. intelligence officers, have shown that there's no evidence for this, that there was no hack of the DNC's system. It was an inside job. It was a leak. And if there was a hack and Russia was responsible, the National Security Agency would have evidence. But they have not been able to get the National Security Agency to release the evidence that would show that this is a bogus claim, because naturally the NSA says, well, we have to maintain secrecy. The whole thing rests on one pillar. And the dissenting views have shown that that pillar is absolutely bankrupt. The problem is the VIPS group has not been able to get their views in the New York Times or on MSNBC or on CNN or the Washington Post. I mean, it's been on the internet in a lot of different sources like Truthdig and Consortium News and Counterpunch, but most Americans do not know that this claim has been absolutely savaged, demolished.
Mm-hmm. And the underlying thing here is that what the big accusation that has already been demolished, as you say, is that the Russians, together with Wikipedia, or with WikiLeaks rather, stole the DNC emails, the Podesta emails, the Clinton emails, and that is the big crime. Now,
right.
Conveniently, the media have forgotten what the content was of those emails. And,
that's right.
which I think we need to remind ourselves about that, because I think we could be being set up for a rerun.
As I state today in this op-ed, no one disputes the content, as you said, of the leaked emails. So the conclusion is the Russians are being accused of attacking our democracy by revealing the truth that the DNC fixed the Democratic primary so Clinton would defeat Bernie Sanders. So we have to ask ourselves, who actually destroyed democracy during our 2016 election? The DNC and the Clinton campaign, or Putin and the Russians? And also, given that supposedly these hacked, that's the accusation, emails were then forwarded to WikiLeaks, one might ask why the Mueller investigation, why no one in the Mueller investigation ever asked Julian Assange to testify. No one ever questioned him about this. He has denied absolutely up and down that they did not get these hacked things from the Russians. And here's somebody who's absolutely critical to this case, and he wasn't even questioned. In any country in the world, except for here with this stupid electoral college, Hillary Clinton would have won the presidency. She had 3 million more votes than Trump. Now, did Putin and the Russians create the profoundly undemocratic electoral college, which was, of course, designed by the founders to make sure the people didn't vote directly for the president? So that created a situation in which Clinton essentially won the popular vote, but yet was denied being president. Now, if you had an election in Talent or Ashland or Eugene or Oregon or any state or any country in the world, basically, and you got more votes than I did, you would be the winner. One has to ask, why did the Democrats made so much of Russia and Putin and didn't come out right away after the election pushing through, at least in the House of Representatives, a bill abolishing the Electoral College, and then, of course, sending it, to the people to amend the Constitution? No, they didn't do it. They didn't do it. This hidden agenda has always been about the Russians and Putin. It's not about democracy, and it really has nothing to do with Trump, who's absolutely vile, and as I argue in my piece, should be impeached for all of his wars that blatantly violate the Constitution.
Well, there's a problem, of course, in that, Democratic presidents have engaged in exactly the same behavior.
That's right.
And we've seen recently on the internet, Nancy Pelosi admitting that she was aware the weapons of mass destruction excuse for Iraq was a lie, and that she did nothing about it and intentionally scuttled any effort to impeach George W. Bush, who lied us into a war that cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and we're still counting the money.
And the Republicans engage in this also. I mean, basically, a number of people have argued, like Paul Street and others, that really, the Democrats are one wing of the bird of prey in terms of war. The Republicans have done this, of course. The Democrats do it. But the Democrats, and this is what sort of elicits more outrage from me, the Republicans have moved so far to the right that they're real neo-fascist elements in that party, brutally racist, homophobic, misogynist. And the Democrats, clearly on domestic issues, because of their much more progressive base in the black community, among women and others, are better on domestic issues. But when it comes to war, when it comes to breaking Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, about that Congress shall declare war, they're both on the same page. I mean, the Democrats applauded Trump when he bombed Syria, and they went crazy when he floated the idea of withdrawing troops from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and Syria. So they pretend that they're much better than the Republicans. But if you really look at the history of the Democratic Party, let's say really beginning with Andrew Jackson, I'd think that they beat the Republicans hands down when it comes to killing people in the U.S., beginning with the Indian Wars and the Mexican War, and then abroad. The Republicans are not pacifists by any means, we know that. But it's astounding. It's just really astounding.
It's the same piece here. This anti-Russian hysteria really is also at the root of the so-called Ukraine Gate and the accusations against Trump on the Zelensky phone call. Because here we had a number of the people testifying before the Intelligence Committee who were State Department or intelligence or military people, making fairly clear that the problem with Trump here was that he was not following the consensus of the establishment agencies about using Ukraine to fight Russia. So we didn't really get into, and I don't think they want to get into, the involvement of the Obama administration in the coup in 2014, nor do they want to get into Hunter Biden's various attempts to make money.
There's a whole, again, hidden agenda around the Ukraine in terms of the government there. for whatever people may think about the previous government before the coup, in terms of its own corruption, it was a democratically elected government. The U.S. clearly was involved. I mean, Victoria Nuland openly said that they had pumped $5 million into various NGOs in the Ukraine, the Endowment for Democracy, which we've been doing all over the world for a long time, beginning with the CIA, funding various fronts. So we were up to our eyeballs in the Ukraine. And of course, that triggered the resistance in the eastern part of the country, then supported by Putin and the Russians. And of course, that triggered the Russians trying to retake Crimea, which had been part of Russia for a long time. Those are issues that, if opened honestly, are going to put the Democrats in the crosshairs, and that's not going to happen. It may happen in the Senate, but it's not going to be discussed. Rachel Maddow's not going to spend day after day, segment after segment, about what the Democrats did to overthrow the government in the Ukraine and any of the connections of Hunter Biden, of Joe Biden, the stuff around Obama. She's not going to spend a lot of time on, in terms of Obama being the one that opened the doors to support Saudi Arabia and Yemen, Obama at the urging of Clinton and others in terms of what happened in Libya. No, that's so they have, the quote unquote liberal media led by MSNBC, CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post have really structured the narrative in a way that, and I must say quite honestly, has made many otherwise progressive people here in the Valley, and I'm sure in the rest of Oregon and the country, pretty stupid when it comes to knowing things about what the U.S. has been doing abroad, and particularly around the former Soviet Union and Russia. I mean, the claims that I've heard people make about these topics are really appalling, that I simply wouldn't be able to listen without raising some questions if students in my own college classes had been making these, what I call grand assertions, which have caused some of people like myself to be called a Putin dupe.
Right, yes. The situation I find so interesting is that here we have so many instances in which U.S. presidents have started wars without benefit of Congress. And also we have a law in this country that we're not supposed to transfer weapons and sell weapons to countries that violate human rights or aggress against their neighbors. But of course, Saudi Arabia would be prime place that it would be under that law illegal to give them, sell them weapons. Ditto Israel, and certainly ditto Ukraine. I mean, there's no question that it would be illegal to give Ukraine weapons, yet we are impeaching a president for apparently implying that he might delay weapons transfers to that country.
Yeah, and all the claims, from Adam Schiff and others, that they're really, and Nancy Pelosi, that this is about the Constitution almost makes me want to gag. For example, the United States has not officially declared war against any country since June 5th, 1942. I believe it was against Bulgaria or Romania, one of the Nazi Axis allies in Eastern Europe. Okay? So since then, and particularly beginning in 1945, the United States has been involved in countless, it's hard to even know how many wars, covert actions, etc., all in violation of our Constitution and international law. And where's the Congress? Where's the Congress? It's people talking about how much they're committed to the Constitution and they have to follow the Constitution, about Trump, because he's this and he's that, which he is. And the outrage about Ukraine is really it's tragic, but also laughable. And I argue that the Democrats today are the fake opposition to a violent Republican president, just as the Democrats were in 1974 when they did not pass an article against Richard Nixon for the illegal and secret bombing of Cambodia. Mm-hmm. They passed other articles, okay? And of course, he resigned before there was any vote. So there's all of this outrage, passionate outrage about Ukraine, but killing thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Arabs and Muslims, mostly civilians, many of them women and children, in Afghanistan and Libya and Yemen and Syria and Iraq. That's just fine. There's no massive outrage whatsoever. And it actually is quite sickening, Charles. It really is.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Well, I don't think we have time to make ourselves any sicker today. Yeah. I think we've run out of time, at least for my show. But again, I very much appreciate your coming on the show, and I really appreciate the articles that you're getting published in the Ashland Tidings and elsewhere. And you have any new books coming out, or?
No. I mean, who knows? I might do something else with my co-author, Jeremy Kuzmarov, who, by the way, came out with a great book on Obama's foreign policy earlier this year. It's a great book. He really lays out the whole issue on Obama, which virtually no liberals and Democrats around here or anywhere want to touch.
No.
They will not use a universal standard that if killing people is wrong and breaking the Constitution, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. It's the principle.
And it's exactly that undermines the Democrats' integrity as a party and discourages people from trusting them and wanting to vote for them. It's totally counterproductive. Well, we can go on.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thanks again to John Marciano for being my guest this week. John is Professor Emeritus at the State University of New York at Cortland and has been a lifelong activist for peace and justice. He attended the very first SDS March Against the American War in Vietnam on April 17, 1965, and was a founding member of the SDS chapter at SUNY Buffalo. John is the author with Jeremy Kuzmarov of The Russians Are Coming Again. The first Cold War is Tragedy, the second is Farce. And Jeremy Kuzmarov will be a guest on this program in the coming weeks to discuss his new book, Obama's Unending Wars, Fronting the Foreign Policy of the Permanent Warfare State. As always, the views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of this radio station. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.